On a Wednesday morning in February of 1983, at the Cass County Equipment Auction in Weeping Water, Nebraska, a 51-year-old farmer named Harlan Dewey raised his hand for a lot that nobody else wanted. The auctioneer had called it 3 times. 55 acres of hardpan clay on the east side of the county, part of the old Reinhardt estate, sitting along a creek bottom that flooded twice in wet years and cracked open like a dry riverbed in dry ones. The bidding sheet had one name crossed off and 2 blank lines beneath it. Men in the crowd shifted their weight and looked at their boots. A few looked at each other. Nobody raised a hand. Harlan raised his. $210 an acre. $11,550 total. Cash, no loan, no bank involved. He wrote the check at the folding table by the auctioneer's trailer, while the crowd moved on to the next lot, a set of grain bins that drew 11 bidders and went for twice what anyone expected. Nobody watched him write it. Nobody thought it was worth watching. Let me tell you about those 55 acres because you need to understand what Harlan actually bought before you can understand what he did with it. The ground sat in a shallow basin between 2 gentle rises, the kind of land that looks almost reasonable from a county road, but tells a different story the moment you step off the gravel. The topsoil was thin, 4 inches in the best spots, less than 2 on the rises where wind and water had worked it for decades. Below that topsoil, starting at 8 or 9 inches down, was the hardpan, a layer of clay so compressed and dense it registered over 300 pounds per square inch on a penetrometer. Corn roots cannot push through anything above 300. They hit that layer and stop curl sideways and spend the summer trying to find water that isn't there. In a dry July, a crop on hardpan burns from the bottom up, while the farmer watches and the banker watches, and nobody says anything useful. 3 owners had tried to farm that ground before the Reinhardt family gave up on it entirely. The first planted corn 2 years running and walked away owing more than he made. The second tried winter wheat and lost half his stand to standing water after a wet April. The third lasted 1 season, pulled his equipment out in August before the crop was even worth harvesting, and told the county assessor he would sooner dig fence posts for a living than fight that ground one more day. After that, the Reinhardts leased it for grazing at $4 an acre to a cattle operation that used it lightly and kept it barely. When old Raymond Reinhardt died without sons, the estate went to auction, and the 55 acres went last because it always went last. Roger Stiles heard about it that same afternoon. Roger was 44 years old and ran the Case IH dealership on the highway south of Plattsmouth. He had a good handshake and a better memory for names, which is most of what you need to sell equipment in a county where everybody went to school together and holds grudges accordingly. His suits were clean, his pickup was new, and the gold watch on his left wrist caught light in a way that let you know it was meant to. He had sold equipment to nearly every serious farmer in Cass County over the past 12 years, and he had opinions about all of them. When his parts manager mentioned it over the phone that Harlan Dewey had bought the Reinhardt hardpan for $210 an acre, Roger was standing in the showroom in front of a new Case IH 2594 that listed at $41,000. He laughed loud enough that 2 customers at the parts counter turned around. He drove to the feed store in Weeping Water the following Saturday and found 4 or 5 men he knew standing near the back by the seed display. He told the story the way men tell stories they want to stay told. Harlan Dewey just bought 55 acres of concrete. I have sold equipment to every serious farmer in this county, and the serious ones buy ground that grows crops. That ground has not grown a profitable crop since before any of us were born, and there is a reason for that. It is not a fixable reason. It is a geological reason. He is going to spend 2 or 3 years learning what 3 other farmers already learned the hard way, and then he is going to try to sell it, and I will be there when he does. I will probably have to buy it back from him myself for what he paid just to keep him from losing his shirt. The men laughed. The kid stacking clover seed on the far shelf smiled at the floor. Roger bought a cup of coffee from the machine by the door, said his goodbyes, and drove back to Plattsmouth on the county road that ran along the east edge of the Reinhardt ground. He did not slow down when he passed it. Harlan did not hear about what Roger said until the following week, when his neighbor Ed Pollock mentioned it sideways while they were fixing a shared fence line. Harlan listened, nodded once, and went back to working the wire. Ed watched him for a moment, waiting for something more, and when nothing came, he went back to working the wire too. Let me tell you about Harlan Dewey because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Harlan was born in 1932 on the same land his father farmed and his grandfather had broken from prairie grass. He grew up watching Glenn Dewey work 160 acres with a Farmall M, a two-bottom plow, and a philosophy about debt that never changed in 40 years. Glenn had taken out one mortgage in his life, paid it off in 1955, and after that refused every loan offer that came through the door. When the Federal Land Bank sent a man out in 1974 to talk about operating lines of credit, Glenn listened politely, thanked him for the drive, and walked him back to his car without signing anything. The man had driven 40 minutes from the county seat. Glenn had wasted none of his time and none of his money on the visit, and he considered that a fair outcome. Glenn died in the fall of 1969, debt-free, leaving Harlan the 160 acres, a workshop full of hand tools, and a Farmall M with 11,000 hours on the meter and plenty left to give. Harlan's older brother Curtis had moved to Omaha in 1961 and wanted no part of the farm. So it was all Harlan's. He did not expand, he did not borrow. He farmed the 160 acres the way his father had corn and alfalfa in rotation, a few head of cattle on the creek pasture hay in the low ground. He kept the running. He drove a 1968 Ford pickup that he had bought used and maintained himself. He wore the same canvas jacket for 8 years, and while his neighbors were signing papers for new equipment and larger parcels at prices that made the bankers nervous even as they wrote the loans, Harlan put $400 a month into an account at the Weeping Water State Bank. By February of 1983, he had $52,000 in that account. He had also been watching the Reinhardt ground for 6 years. His wife Norma knew about it before he said a word. That was how it worked between them. She would notice where his eyes went when they drove past certain ground, and she would file it away, and eventually one of them would say what the other had already thought. They had been married long enough that the distance between a thought and a conversation had compressed to almost nothing. The night before the auction, she had set his coffee down across from her at the kitchen table and said it plainly. "Your daddy always said the ground nobody wants is the ground nobody's ruined yet." Harlan had looked at his cup. Then he had nodded and gone to bed, and in the morning he had driven to Weeping Water and raised his hand. Now, before I tell you what Harlan planned to do with that ground, I need to tell you what was happening in Nebraska in the winter of 1983, because the world Harlan was walking into was not the world most farmers around him thought they were still living in. In the 1970s, American agriculture went through an expansion that felt from inside it like it would never end. Grain prices climbed year after year. Corn touched $3.50 a bushel. Soybeans ran past $8. Land prices in Nebraska nearly tripled between 1972 and 1981. Banks were not just willing to lend, they were actively recruiting borrowers. Federal Land Bank officers drove county roads looking for farmers who had not yet leveraged their equity, and they had good arguments. The world needs food. You are sitting on an asset that goes up every year. Borrow against it, buy more, grow bigger. It was reasonable advice inside the moment it was given. Then the moment ended. In 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to break inflation. By 1981, the prime rate was running at 21.5%. Farm operating loans written at 9% were renewing at 18%. At the same time, the grain export markets that had driven the boom collapsed when President Carter imposed an embargo against the Soviet Union and commodity prices fell hard. Nebraska farmland, which had peaked at over $2,000 an acre in parts of the state, began dropping $200 an acre per year and did not stop. Between 1983 and 1988, more than 14,000 Nebraska farm operations would be lost. The Federal Land Bank of Omaha, which had encouraged so much of the borrowing, was moving toward a failure that would be the first of its kind since the Great Depression. Towns were already starting to thin. The high school in one county lost a third of its enrollment in 2 years. Farmers who had done everything right by the standards of the previous decade were losing everything they had built. That was the world Harlan Dewey bought 55 acres of hardpan into. He drove out to the ground the first Saturday after the auction closed. Norma rode along and stayed in the truck with the window down, while Harlan walked the full perimeter first and then worked his way across in a grid carrying a notebook and a soil probe. His father had turned on a metal lathe in the workshop in 1959. The probe was a T-handled steel tube hand ground to a point with depth markings scratched into the shaft in his father's handwriting. Glenn had made it for himself and used it for 11 years before Harlan inherited it along with everything else. The handwriting on the shaft had faded to near invisible in places, but Harlan knew what the mark said. He took 39 samples. He noted the depth to hardpan at every point, the color change in the subsoil where water had pooled and dried in the surface, clay where the slopes faced south and baked where they faced north and stayed wet too long into spring. He mapped it by hand on graph paper that evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Norma moved around the kitchen behind him and did not ask questions because she understood that he was still listening to the ground. He pressed the probe down into the hard pan at his 14th sample point and felt it stop at 9 inches with the particular resistance that experienced farmers recognize immediately. Not rock, not a root. The flat, uniform, indifferent resistance of compressed clay that has been pressed by tillage equipment at the same depth for so many years, it has fused into something close to pavement. He held the probe there and thought about his father. Glenn had explained hardpan to him once standing at the edge of a neighbor's field in 1961 when Harlan was about 29 years old and still learning the ways ground could defeat you. Glenn had pressed his boot heel into the soil and looked at the way it barely marked the surface. This is what happens when you run iron across the same level for 30 years, Glenn had said. You are not farming the ground anymore. You are farming the lid you put on it, and the longer the lid sits, the thicker it gets. Harlan pulled the probe out, recorded the measurement, and moved to his 15th sample point. Let me tell you about what he found because the numbers mattered, and the numbers were not encouraging. At the worst points along the north rise and at the low center of the basin, the hard pan layer was running between 320 and 340 pounds per square inch. That measurement comes from an instrument called a penetrometer, a cone-tip probe calibrated to register the resistance of soil. Agronomists and soil conservationists use it to assess compaction. The threshold that matters for corn production is 300 pounds per square inch. Below that number, corn roots push through without major restriction. Above it, roots stop, curl, and the plant spends the growing season in a kind of slow stranglehold, unable to access moisture or nutrients below the pan layer. At 340, roots do not push through. They simply stop the way a man stops when he walks into a wall in the dark. 320 pounds per square inch meant the hard pan was not marginal. It was decisive. The standard remedy in 1983, the thing any county extension agent or equipment dealer would recommend, was a subsoiler. A heavy shanked implement pulled through the soil at 16 to 22 inches, shattering the compacted layer mechanically. Roger Stiles rented a Case IH subsoiler attachment from his lot for $28 an acre. 55 acres would run $1,540 for a single pass. That pass needed to be repeated every 3 or 4 years if conventional tillage continued, because conventional tillage would rebuild the pan at the same rate the subsoiler broke it. It was a solution that solved nothing permanently. It was a subscription, and the ground was the one setting the billing cycle. Harlan was not interested in subscriptions. He found Earl Fitch through a name his father had mentioned years earlier, the way Glenn had sometimes mentioned names, the way other men left tools on a workbench, placed where they might be needed later. Earl was 74 years old, a retired soil conservationist who had spent 26 years working for the USDA in 3 Nebraska counties before age and a bad hip pushed him into a small house on 40 acres 4 miles south of Weeping Water. He still kept a soil probe in his truck. He still read the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation, which arrived by mail and which he annotated in the margins with a pencil. He had been retired for 8 years and still read it cover to cover every issue because he believed the ground did not stop being interesting just because he had stopped drawing a government salary. Harlan called him on a Tuesday evening in March, explained what he had bought and what the penetrometer reading showed, and asked if Earl would come look at the ground. Earl said he would come Saturday. He did not ask what Harlan intended to do with it. He would look at the ground first and form his opinions from that. They walked the 55 acres together for 3 hours. Earl took his own samples, independent of Harlan's, and compared them at the fence line when they finished. He stood with the 2 sets of data for a long time looking at the numbers, and then looking at the ground, and then looking at the numbers again. Every man who tried to farm this, Earl said, finally tried to force it. Subsoiler, heavy disc, deep, plow. Break it by power. You cannot sustain that. The pan reforms. The biology underneath never gets a chance to stabilize. You are fighting the same fight every 3 years and wondering why you keep losing. He looked at the basin where the worst compaction was concentrated. You cannot force hardpan, you have to convince it. He explained what he meant over coffee at Harlan's kitchen table that afternoon. Biological subsoiling. Use deep-rooted cover crops, daikon radish, specifically to continue mechanically what a steel shank started. The radish roots grow 12 to 24 inches into the soil, penetrating the pan layer, and creating channels that persist after the plant decomposes. Those channels allow water infiltration, root penetration by subsequent crops, and the movement of soil organisms that rebuild structure from below. Combine that with a rotation that included nitrogen-fixing legumes, alfalfa primarily, and managed grazing at low stocking rates, and the ground would begin to change its own chemistry and physics over a period of 3 to 5 years. It would not be fast. Earl was precise about that. It would not be free. There would be years with no marketable crop. There would be years that looked from the road exactly like Roger Stiles had predicted they would look. But it would be permanent. That was the difference. What Harlan was considering is not a repair. It was a reconstruction. Harlan listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions. Earl answered them directly and without softening anything. When Earl left, Norma came in from the garden and poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Harlan was sitting at the table looking at his graph paper maps. She looked at the maps, then at him. He's asking you to farm ground that won't pay you for 3 years, she said. It was not a question. At least 3, Harlan said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, isn't 3 years better than farming the same broken way for 30? Harlan looked up from the maps. She had already turned back to the sink. Let me tell you about what happened in the spring of 1983, because that is where the actual work began, and the actual work is what this story is really about. Harlan built the subsoiler himself. He did it over 4 evenings in the workshop, working under a single drop light, using the cutting torch and the welder his father had bought in 1952 and maintained for 30 years. The frame came from a worn-out cultivator that had been sitting behind the barn since 1977. The shank was cut from a piece of 4-inch beam stock salvaged from a collapsed machinery shed on the Pollock place next door. The wing points were ground down from an old plowshare that had lost its edge but still had its steel. On the 4th evening, when the last weld cooled and Harlan set the thing on its shank in the workshop doorway and looked at it under the overhead light, it was not pretty. It was built for one purpose and it looked like it. The total cost of materials was $340. He had priced a new Case IH subsoiler at Roger Stiles' lot the previous fall, not because he intended to buy it, but because he wanted to know the number, $4,200. He ran the Farmall M out of the barn on a Thursday morning in late April. The air was cold enough to see his breath. He hitched the homemade subsoiler to the drawbar, checked the hitch pin twice, and walked around the whole assembly once before he climbed up. Then he sat in the seat for a moment and listened to the engine at idle the way his father had taught him to listen before starting any new task with new equipment. He heard something first before he moved the tractor forward. The M's exhaust had a particular sound at idle, a low, even pulse, that Harlan had heard so many times in his life that it had stopped registering as a sound and become something closer to a feeling, the feeling of the machine being ready. He heard it now. He put the M in gear. The shank bit in at 16 inches and the engine loaded immediately. The M slowed from its working pace to something closer to a deliberate walk. The exhaust note deepened and steadied. The ground behind him opened in long seams, dark and disrupted, smelling of the deep clay that had not seen air in decades, a smell Harlan associated with the kind of soil that has been closed off for so long it has forgotten what growing things feel like. He thought of what his father used to say about that tractor standing in the barn door watching it idle. She is not fast, son, but she is honest. It took 11 days to complete the subsoil pass across all 55 acres, working around the steeper rise on the north end where the M could not maintain traction safely. On the 3rd day, the sky opened and dropped 2 inches of rain in 4 hours. Harlan waited in the barn until it passed and then walked the field to check the seams. The water had gone down into the subsoil channels instead of running off the surface. He stood there for a moment looking at that and said nothing because there was no one to say anything to and because the evidence did not need his commentary. When the pass was finished, he broadcast daikon radish seed at 8 pounds per acre across the subsoiled ground, walking the rows with a canvas shoulder bag in the May wind, the same way his father had broadcast clover 40 years before him, on different ground with different problems and the same patience. Danny Pruitt came out in June. He was 26 years old, new to the county assessor's office, assigned to update records on parcels that had changed hands at auction. He pulled in on the gravel approach, got out of his county car with a clipboard and a polite expression, and looked at the ground for a moment before he spoke. "Mr. Dewey," he said, "what exactly is your plan for this ground?" It was a fair question. What Harlan had done looked from the outside like a man who had spent money to make his bad ground worse. The subsoil was disrupted and rough. The daikon seed was invisible. There was nothing growing that anyone would recognize as a crop. "I'm going to let the ground tell me what it wants to become," Harlan said, "and then I am going to help it get there." Danny wrote something on his clipboard. He looked at the ground again. Then he looked at the old M parked at the field edge, its red paint faded to the color of old brick, its front axle carrying a little rust along the housing where the paint had chipped. "That tractor pull, all that by itself, she did," Harlan said. Danny nodded slowly in the way young men nod when they are genuinely uncertain what they are looking at. He thanked Harlan and got back in his county car and drove away on the gravel. Harlan watched the car until it turned onto the county road and disappeared, and then he walked back out into the field. By August, the daikon radish was 18 inches tall and growing fast, its thick white shoulders visible above the surface in places, its roots already working down through the channels the subsoiler shank had opened, reaching for the loosened clay below the broken pan layer. Roger Stiles drove past on the county road that month. He did not stop. He slowed enough to look, then drove on. Later at the Case IAH regional dealer meeting in Lincoln, he told the story again, refined now from 6 months of retelling. The men at the table found it entertaining. "Let me tell you where that story stood at the end of 1983, because the numbers are the foundation of everything that came after. Total investment in the 55 acres in year one, $11,550 for the land, $340 for the homemade subsoiler, $180 for daikon seed, and approximately $400 in diesel and maintenance, running the M for 11 days of subsoil work and follow-up passes. Total $12,470. Marketable crop harvested none. Revenue from the ground in year 10. From the road, it looked exactly like Roger Stiles said it would look. Below the surface, at 16 inches down in the dark and the cold and the silence that soil keeps, when no one is watching, the daikon roots were doing something that no dollar amount had ever been able to do on that ground before. They were convincing it. The winter of 1983 went out slow and gray, the way Nebraska winters do, when they are not finished with you, but have run out of new things to say. Harlan spent December and January in the workshop sharpening tools, replacing a worn bearing on the M's front axle, and reading everything Earl Fitch had loaned him about soil biology and no-till establishment. Earl had a particular book, a USDA technical guide from 1977 on cover crop management in compacted soils that Harlan read 3 times and marked in pencil the way his father had marked the margins of almanacs. The margins of that book filled up with Harlan's handwriting over the winter. In February of 1984, he spread manure. He had made a deal the previous fall with a dairy operation 12 miles north, run by a man named Vern Clausen, who had more manure than storage capacity and was glad to let someone haul it at no charge if they brought their own equipment. Harlan borrowed Ed Pollock's spreader and made 17 loads across 4 weekends, running the M slowly across the subsoil ground in the cold, spreading 8 to 10 tons per acre on the flatter sections and lighter on the rises where runoff was a concern. The work was not glamorous. It was cold, and it smelled, and it was exactly the kind of labor that is invisible to everyone who is not doing it. Norma brought lunch out in a covered dish on the 3rd weekend and sat in the truck cab while Harlan ate, and neither of them said much because the wind was enough noise for both of them. The daikon radish had winter killed in November, which was the plan. The tops had collapsed and were already decomposing into the surface, adding organic matter, and below the ground the roots had left behind something more valuable than the plant itself. Channels, vertical passages through the hard pan layer, some of them close to an inch in diameter, open highways for water and air, and the soil organisms that had been locked out of the deep clay for 30 years. Those channels would not close on their own. They would stay open, waiting for something to use them. Harlan seeded alfalfa in late March. He used a hand-cranked broadcast seeder across the flatter acres and no-till drilled the steeper ground with an older drill he had borrowed and modified with heavier coulters to cut through the surface residue. The alfalfa seed cost him $220. Let me tell you what alfalfa does, because the men in this story who underestimated Harlan Dewey underestimated the plant at the same time. Alfalfa is a legume, which means its roots form a partnership with soil bacteria called rhizobium that pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into a form plants can use directly. A strong alfalfa stand fixes between 100 and 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year without a bag of fertilizer being opened. That is the equivalent of $40 to $75 an acre in anhydrous ammonia delivered for free every year as long as the stand holds. But the root system is what mattered most to Harlan's ground. Alfalfa roots in favorable conditions reach 6 feet deep or more, following the channels the daikon had opened and extending them further, creating a biological architecture in the soil that holds its structure after the plant is gone. The roots also produce compounds that feed the microbial communities in the surrounding soil, the bacteria and fungi and protozoa that break down organic matter into the minerals plants need. Ground that has been biologically dead for years begins slowly to remember what it is supposed to be. Harlan did not use any commercial fertilizer in 1984. He did not use any herbicide. His operating cost for the year on the 55 acres was the alfalfa seed, the diesel to spread manure and run the drill, and his own time, which he did not count separately because it was his ground, and his time was not a cost he billed to anyone. Year 2 total operating cost on the 55 acres approximately $600. Roger Stiles in 1984 sold 14 new Case 1H tractors in Cass County. He also took back 3 machines from customers who could no longer make payments. He remarketed 2 of them at a loss and held the third on his lot through the winter, reducing the asking price twice. He did not drive past Harlan's ground in the spring of 1984. He had other things to think about. Year 2 passed. The alfalfa established slowly unevenly in the way it always does the first season on difficult ground. There were gaps in the stand where the hard pan had not broken completely and the seed could not root deeply enough. Harlan noted them, added those sections to a list of ground to subsoil again the following spring, and said nothing about it to anyone. He cut 2 small sections of established alfalfa in August and sold the hay to Vern Clausen, who was now getting something back from the arrangement besides goodwill. Revenue from the ground in year 2, $840. He was not breaking even. He knew he was not breaking even. He also knew that was not what year 2 was for. Let me tell you about the conversation that changed the direction of what Harlan was building, because it happened by accident the way the important conversations usually do. In the fall of 1984, Harlan attended a soil conservation meeting at the Cass County Extension Office in Plattsmouth. He had gone because Earl Fitch had mentioned a speaker worth hearing, a soil scientist from the University of Nebraska named Dr. Carolyn Voss, who had been studying biological compaction remediation in clay soils across the eastern part of the state. He sat in the back row and took notes on a folded piece of paper, the kind of notes a man takes when he is not trying to remember what was said, but to understand it well enough to use it. After the meeting, when most of the attendees had filed out to the parking lot, Harlan waited. He introduced himself to Dr. Voss and showed her his penetrometer records, the grid maps from the original survey, and the comparison readings he had taken the previous July after 18 months of cover crop work. The hard pan layer, which had registered 320 pounds per square inch in early 1983, was now reading 260 in the areas with the deepest daikon root penetration. Dr. Voss studied the numbers for a long time. She looked at the maps. She looked at the numbers again. "How many acres did you say?" 55, Harlan told her. "And you did the initial subsoil past yourself with what equipment?" "A 1948 Farmall M and a homemade shank." He told her the material cost. She set the papers down and looked at him the way people look when they have just recalculated something significant. "Mr. Dewey," she said, "most farmers trying to remediate compaction this severe are spending between $40 and $60 an acre per year on mechanical tillage, in synthetic inputs, and making incremental progress at best. You are showing me a 60-point pressure drop in 18 months at a fraction of that cost. I would like to come out and take my own samples in the spring if you are willing." He was willing. The drive home from Plattsmouth ran along the same county roads Harlan had driven his whole life. Somewhere on that stretch, with the headlights cutting the November dark, and the fields on both sides already showing frost, his father's voice arrived the way it sometimes did, unprompted and precise. Glenn had said it once at breakfast, not directed at anyone in particular, the way he sometimes spoke thoughts that had been sitting in him for a while. Patience is just stubbornness that turned out to be right. Harlan had not known at the time which problem his father was thinking about. He understood now that it did not matter. Year 3, 1985. Harlan subsoiled the remaining poor sections again in April, this time running the shank at 18 inches instead of 16 to break deeper into the clay below the original pan layer. The M ran hard for 7 days on that pass, the exhaust note carrying across the field in the April wind. On the 4th day, a hydraulic line on the subsoiler frame developed a weep, and Harlan stopped, climbed down, wrapped the fitting with tape as a temporary measure, drove to weeping water for the correct ferrule and sleeve, and was back in the field before noon. Cost of that repair, $11.40. He called Roger Stiles' lot from the phone at the parts counter while he waited for his order, not to speak to Roger, but to ask the parts manager what a replacement hydraulic line for a Case IH subsoiler ran. $43 for the fitting assembly labor extra. He thanked the man and hung up. Dr. Voss came in May with 2 graduate students and a truck full of equipment. They spent 2 days on the 55 acres taking soil samples at 31 points, measuring water infiltration rates with a double-ring infiltrometer, counting earthworms and cubic foot excavations at 12 locations, and running a full panel of chemistry tests on samples they took back to Lincoln. Harlan walked with them the first morning and answered questions, then left them to work and went back to his own. Danny Pruitt came out the same week to update the parcel records again for the county. He was a year older and had started to understand that what he was looking at on this parcel was not what it had looked like the last time he had come. He stood at the fence line watching the graduate students work for a moment before he walked over to find Harlan. "What are the university people doing?" he asked. "Counting earthworms," Harlan told him. Danny looked at the graduate students crouched in the field with their measuring frames and their notebooks. "How many are there more than there used to be?" Harlan said. Cost comparison for 1985. Harlan's 3-year total investment in the ground, including the original purchase, the subsoiler materials, all seed, all manure, hauling, all fuel, and every repair, $14,210. His neighbor, Tom Krebs, who farmed 140 acres of Class 2 soil 3 miles west with conventional tillage and a full fertilizer and herbicide program, had spent an average of $61 per acre per year in inputs over the same 3 years. On comparable acreage, that was $26,000 in operating costs, not counting equipment payments. Tom Krebs received a federal land bank acceleration notice in October of 1985. He would lose his operation the following spring. Year 3 revenue from the 55 acres, $1,200 in alfalfa hay. Still not breaking even on the annual operation, but the land itself, the asset, was changing in ways the revenue figures did not capture. Dr. Voss sent her preliminary results in a letter in December. Harlan read the letter at the kitchen table. Norma came and stood behind him and read it over his shoulder without asking. When she finished, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder and went back to what she had been doing. She did not say anything because she had said it already 2 years before in the way that mattered. Organic matter up from 0.8% to 2.1%. Earthworm count up from 3 per cubic foot to 11. Water infiltration rate improved by 180%. Penetrometer readings in the deepest recovery zones now averaging 230 pounds per square inch. The ground was not healed, but it was listening. Year 4, 1986. Harlan planted alfalfa for a 3rd season on the 20 acres that had responded best, and for the first time, he planted corn on the 12 flattest, most recovered acres in the center of the basin. He planted it no-till using a planter. He modified himself to cut through the alfalfa residue, adding coulter blades salvaged from an old drill and rebolted to the planter frame over 4 evenings in the workshop. Cost of modifications, $62 in hardware. Cost of a new no-till planter from Roger Stiles' lot, $9,800. The corn came up thin. The stand was not what any agronomist would call acceptable by the standards of the day. 3/4 population in the best spots, half population in the areas where the hardpan was still restricting root development below 15 inches. Anyone driving that county road in June of 1986 and looking at Harlan's 12 acres of no-till corn would have seen exactly what Roger Stiles had predicted from the beginning. Roger himself drove past in June and slowed down enough to see the field. He did not stop. That evening, Norma stood at the kitchen window while Harlan washed up at the sink. She was watching the road the way she sometimes did in the evenings. He slowed down to count your rows, she said. Harlan dried his hands. Let him count, he said. He was not looking at the rows either. He was thinking about what was below the rows and what Dr. Voss's data had shown about how the root zone was changing and about what his father had told him in the barn 20 years earlier during the worst season of their lives together on this ground. The hailstorm of 1966 had come through in July and taken 60% of their corn crop in 45 minutes. Harlan had been 34 years old. He had stood in the field afterward and looked at the flattened stalks and felt something he could not name exactly, but that lived in the same part of him as fear. Glenn had come out after him and walked the damage for a while without speaking. Then they had walked back to the barn together, and Glenn had moved around doing what needed doing, and at some point he had stopped and said it without preamble to no one in particular, or to both of them, which was the same thing. The year that beats you is not the year you lose. It is the year you stop believing the next one will be different. Long as you keep believing, the ground keeps owing you. Harlan had written that one down. It was on a card in his wallet, the same wallet he had carried since 1971. The card was soft at the edges from years of being carried next to other things. He thought about that card now standing at the sink in 1986 with thin corn in a field that everyone said would fail. He thought about it and dried his hands and went back to work. Let me tell you about the summer of 1987, because that is the summer the ground finally answered. July came in hot and stayed. 11 consecutive days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with a south wind that drew moisture out of the soil and out of the crops and out of the men working them. The wind was the kind that feels like it has been traveling a long distance and has not picked up anything useful along the way. The National Weather Service station in Omaha recorded the driest July in Nebraska since 1956. Farmers across Cass County watched their corn begin to roll the leaves curling inward along their length to reduce surface area and slow transpiration, which is what corn does when it cannot find enough water to maintain itself. It is not a sign of death, not immediately, but it is a sign that the plant is choosing survival over yield, and yield is what pays the bills. By the fifth day of the heat, the corn in Tom Krebs's fields was rolling by 10 in the morning. Harlan had driven past on his way to Weeping Water and seen it. He understood what it meant. Krebs's ground, for all its Class II rating, had been tilled and treated in ways that left it with low organic matter and a soil structure that could not hold moisture under sustained heat. When the surface dried, it dried fast and deep, and the roots that had been restricted from going lower by years of tillage had nowhere else to look. They were searching in ground that had nothing left to give. Harlan's corn on the 12 acres where 4 years of biological work had rebuilt the soil structure from below did not roll. Not on day 5, not on day 7, not on day 9. The alfalfa root channels that descended below 20 inches were still conducting small amounts of deep moisture upward through capillary action. The macropores the daikon had opened were still holding the water from the last significant rain 3 weeks prior in the lower profile of the soil. The organic matter, now at 2.9% in the center acres, was holding moisture the way a sponge holds water, releasing it slowly and continuously to the root zone. The mycorrhizal fungi that had recolonized the soil biology over 4 years were extending the effective reach of the corn roots beyond what the roots themselves could physically access, pulling phosphorus in water from microcytes throughout the profile. From the county road, Harlan's 12 acres of no-till corn stood green and upright in the heat, while the conventional fields around it showed the gray-green of stressed leaves going defensive. Roger Stiles drove past on the 8th day. He stopped. He sat in his pickup with the engine running for a moment. Then he turned it off. He opened the door and stepped out onto the road shoulder and stood there looking at the field. There was no one with him, no customer, no employee, no one to tell the story to later that would reframe what he was seeing into something manageable. His arms dropped to his sides. His jaw set once tightened and then went slack. The gold watch caught the afternoon light one more time. He did not move. The wind moved through the corn around him, the upright, healthy corn on ground he had publicly declared would never grow a profitable crop, and Roger Stiles stood at the fence with his hands hanging at his sides and said nothing at all. Danny Pruitt pulled in behind Roger's truck 11 minutes later. He had been driving the county road updating parcel notes and had seen the truck parked at an angle on the shoulder that did not look like a planned stop. He got out and walked up and stood beside Roger without saying anything for a moment, because he could see that Roger was not in a state that invited conversation. Then Danny looked at the field himself. He had his penetrometer in the truck. He always had it. He went and got it and climbed the fence and walked to 3 points in the center of Harlan's 12 acres, driving the cone into the soil at each one, and reading the gauge with the care of a man who wants to make sure he is reading correctly before he says the number out loud. 182, 179, 175. He stood at the third point and looked at the gauge and then looked at the corn standing straight and green above him in the heat of the worst July in 30 years. He read the gauge again. The numbers did not change. He climbed back over the fence and found Harlan walking up from the barn end of the field. "Mister," Dewey Danny said, and then stopped because he was not sure what the rest of the sentence was. He held out the penetrometer so Harlan could see the gauge. Harlan looked at the number. 175 pounds per square inch. 60 points below the threshold where corn roots stop. 45 points lower than the best reading Dr. Voss had recorded 2 years earlier. He had bought a field at 320. He was standing in a field at 175. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the corn. He looked at the gauge. He thought about Glenn Dewey in the barn in the winter of 1966 saying the year that beats you is not the year you lose. Then he looked at Danny. "The ground remembers what you put in it," Harlan said. "Give it enough time and it pays you back with interest." Danny wrote that down without being asked. He would quote it word for word 17 years later at a University of Nebraska Soil Health Extension meeting, and the room would be quiet for a moment after he said it, in the way rooms go quiet when a sentence arrives at exactly the right time. Roger Stiles had not moved from the fence. Danny looked at Roger, then at Harlan, and understood clearly that this was not his moment. He thanked Harlan, got in his county car, and drove away on the gravel. Harlan walked to the fence. Roger was still looking at the field. Several seconds passed. A truck moved along the county road in the far distance, and its sound faded. Harlan waited. When Roger finally spoke, his voice was not the voice he used at the feed store or the dealer meetings or the conversations at the co-op where he held court and told the stories that traveled across the county. It was quieter, flatter. The voice of a man who has been looking at evidence for 11 days and has run out of explanations that protect his earlier position. "It's not rolling," Roger said. It was barely a statement. It was closer to a man confirming something to himself that he had been avoiding confirming. "No," Harlan said. "It is not." Roger looked at the field for another moment. Then he looked at Harlan. "I told people this ground was finished," he said. "I said it in public." More than once, Harlan said nothing. Roger turned and walked back to his truck. He opened the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame and stood there for a moment without getting in. "What did you do to it?" he said. Not aggressive, not demanding. The honest question of a man who built his professional life on understanding how agricultural systems work and is standing in front of one he does not understand. Harlan considered the question carefully, the way he considered most things. "I believe my father," he said, "and I gave the ground enough time to believe it too." Roger got in his truck. He started the engine. He sat there for a long moment, with it running long enough that Harlan wondered if he was going to say something else. Then he pulled out onto the county road and drove away, and Harlan watched the truck until it rounded the long curve past the Pollock place and the dust settled back onto the gravel. He stood at his fence line in the heat of the worst July in 30 years, with 12 acres of upright corn behind him and 55 acres of ground that 4 years ago had been declared finished by the most vocal man in the county. He thought about what his father had said about patience. He thought about what Earl Fitch had said about convincing instead of forcing. He thought about Norma at the kitchen table the night before the auction, saying the ground nobody wants is the ground nobody's ruined yet. He thought about a lot of things. Then he walked back to the barn to finish the afternoon's work, because the corn did not care about any of it, and neither did the M, and there was always something left to do before dark. The harvest that fall came in at 127 bushels per acre on the 12 acres of no-till corn. The county average for 1987 across all corn ground in Cass County, including the Class 1 and Class 2 fields that had been farmed with the best inputs money could buy, was 89 bushels per acre. Danny Pruitt recorded the yield in the county parcel notes. He also updated the assessed value on the 55 acres, his third reassessment of that parcel in 4 years. He sent Harlan a letter in September. The 55 acres that Harlan Dewey had purchased in February of 1983 for $210 an acre, $11,550 total, was now assessed at $1,340 per acre. Total assessed value $73,700. Return on the original investment 538% in 4 years with no loan, no interest payment, and no risk of foreclosure. The ground was not finished. It never had been. Roger Stiles did not come back in the fall of 1987. He did not come back in 1988 either. Harlan did not expect him to. Some reckonings happen in private inside the cab of a pickup on a county road, and the man doing the reckoning has to work through what he saw before he can do anything useful with it. Harlan understood that. He had given the ground 4 years to change its mind. He could give Roger Stiles whatever time he needed. The ground, meanwhile, did not wait for anyone. Let me tell you about the years that followed the summer of 1987, because that is where the real accounting happens, and the numbers deserve to be stated plainly. In 1988, Harlan expanded the no-till corn to 30 acres of the 54, the 30 that had shown the deepest biological recovery in Dr. Voss's sampling. The remaining 25 stayed in alfalfa for one more season, continuing to build the nitrogen base and the root architecture the corn would eventually depend on. The yield on the 30 corn acres came in at 138 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 114. His operating cost per bushel with no commercial fertilizer, no herbicide, and no equipment payments was 81 cents. The county average cost per bushel across conventional operations with full input programs and financed equipment was running between $1.90 and $2.10. He was producing more at less than half the cost of the men who had the better ground. In 1990, Harlan made a decision that surprised Ed Pollock, who was the neighbor most likely to notice such things. He stopped conventional tillage on his original 160 acres and converted the entire home farm to the same biological rotation he had built on the 55. It took 2 years to transition. During those 2 years, his yields on the home ground dropped as the system adjusted and the biology established. He had planned for that. He had money in the bank and a method he trusted and a father's voice that had told him, patience is just stubbornness, that turned out to be right. By 1992, the home farm was running the same soil biology numbers that the 55 acres had shown in 1988. He had doubled the scale of the operation without borrowing a dollar. The 1993 drought came harder than 1987. 11 weeks without meaningful rain across much of eastern Nebraska starting in June and not breaking until late August. The National Weather Service called it the worst drought in the state since the 1950s. Corn across Cass County showed moisture stress by the second week of July. By the end of the month, County Extension was estimating crop losses at 30 to 40% of projected yields across conventional operations. Farmers who had borrowed to plant and borrowed to fertilize were watching their margins turn to nothing in the heat. Harlan's ground, both the 55 acres and the home farm, yielded 109 bushels per acre on the corn ground. The county average that year was 71. Danny Pruitt, now 36 years old and senior assessor for the county, drove out personally to verify the yield records before he updated the parcel files. He stood at the field edge with his clipboard and looked at the numbers Harlan had written on the harvest tally sheet, and then he looked at the field, and then he looked at Harlan. Same answer as last time Danny asked. Same ground, Harlan said. Same method. Danny shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the particular way a man shakes his head when the evidence keeps arriving and he keeps not being surprised by it and keeps being surprised that he is not surprised. He wrote the numbers down and drove back to Plattsmouth. Let me tell you about Earl Fitch, because Earl deserves more than a footnote in this accounting. Earl had kept coming out to the 55 acres 2 or 3 times a year through the late 1980s, walking the ground with Harlan in the way of men who do not need to fill silence with words. He had watched the earthworm counts climb, Watch the soil color deepen from the pale clay gray it had been in 1983 to the dark brown that good Nebraska soil is supposed to be. He had read Dr. Voss's subsequent papers, two of which cited the Dewey operation by county and acreage, without naming Harlan directly, and he had marked the relevant passages in pencil and left the copies on Harlan's kitchen table without comment. He never asked whether Harlan had read them. He trusted Harlan to find what he needed in his own time. In the spring of 1991, Earl's hip finally ended his walking days on rough ground. He could still manage the driveway and the barn approach, but the field itself was past him. He came out one last time in May, sitting in the passenger seat of Harlan's truck, while Harlan drove the field roads between the rows, and Earl looked at the ground from the window the way a man looks at something he loves and is saying goodbye to. "You didn't just fix that ground," Earl said. He was watching the alfalfa on the south end, thick and dark and humming with bees in the May afternoon. "You proved it was never as broken as they said." There is a difference between those two things. Harlan drove to the corner of the field and stopped the truck. "It was never broken," he said. "It was just tired and badly handled." Earl nodded once. He did not say anything else about it. Earl Fitch died in October of 1991 at 82 years old in the small house on the 40 acres south of Weeping Water. His obituary in the Plattsmouth Journal ran 4 paragraphs and mentioned his USD, a career, and his family. It did not mention the conversation at the kitchen table in 1983, or the 3 hours walking the Reinhardt ground with a soil probe, or the single sentence that changed what 55 acres of hardpan eventually became. "You cannot force hardpan, you have to convince it." 4 words that cost Earl nothing to say and changed the direction of everything. Harlan named the southeast corner of the field Fitch Corner. He did not put up a sign. He just called it that, and eventually Norma called it that too. And after a while, it was simply what that corner was named, the way places get named by the people who care about them, until the name becomes the truth. In the fall of 1993, Roger Stiles came back. He called first, which Harlan had not expected. He called on a Tuesday evening and said he would like to come out on Saturday if that was agreeable. Harlan said it was. He did not tell Norma until Thursday, and when he did, she listened, and then said she would make sure there was coffee, and then went back to what she had been doing, because Norma had learned over 40 years of marriage that some things resolve themselves if you give them enough space and time, and Roger Stiles coming to the farm on a Saturday was one of those things. He arrived at 9 in the morning in a car Harlan did not recognize, a Ford sedan with no company name on the door, older than the pickups Roger used to drive. He was wearing a canvas jacket that was not new. The gold watch was not on his wrist. Harlan noticed these things without remarking on them. They sat at the kitchen table. Norma poured coffee and then went to work in the garden with the door to the porch open in the October air, and Harlan and Roger sat with their cups in the quiet between them that had been accumulating since 1983. Roger spoke first. "I sold equipment in this county for 22 years, he said. "I told every farmer who would listen that they needed more iron, more acres, more inputs, more payments. I believed it. I was not lying to them. I believed the model, because the model worked while the prices held, and the interest was low, and the exports were strong, and I kept believing it after those things stopped being true, because I had staked my professional identity on it, and admitting it was wrong would have meant admitting I had hurt people I knew by name." He turned his coffee cup on the table. A slow half circle. "I closed the lot in 1989. I had a garage operation going through 92. I tried to make parts and service work, but I had too much overhead I couldn't unwind and not enough cash to write it out." He paused. "I let 2 men go who had worked for me for 11 years. One of them found something. The other one is still looking." Harlan looked at his cup. "I drove past your field in 1987, and I didn't stop right away," Roger said. "I drove about a mile past, and then I pulled over on the section line and sat there for a while." He shook his head slowly. "That thin stand on 12 acres out-yielded every Class 1 field in the county in the worst drought in 30 years. And I had driven past it 20 times telling myself it was going to fail." He stopped. "I was wrong about the ground," he said, "and I said so publicly, which means I owe you a public accounting. But I don't think you want that, and the people who heard me the first time are mostly gone now anyway." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Through the open porch door, he could hear Norma working in the garden, the small sounds of tools and soil. Roger had said what he came to say. What came next was not forgiveness exactly, because Harlan had not spent 10 years in anger. What came next was simply the truth delivered the way his father had always delivered truth, without decoration and without delay. "You were selling iron," Roger Harlan said. "I was buying time." He looked at him directly across the table. Turns out time was the only thing that ground ever needed. Roger sat with that. The October light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table between them. Neither man moved for a moment. Then Roger said there was one more thing. A young farmer, 28 years old, renting ground in Odo County, had come to Roger looking for advice about a parcel of difficult ground he had the chance to buy cheap. Ground everyone said was past farming. Roger had told him he did not know enough anymore to advise him on equipment, but he knew a man in Cass County who had done something with difficult ground that was worth understanding before the young man made his decision. Would Harlan be willing to talk to him? Harlan said he would. The young man came out 2 weeks later, a lanky kid named Brent Alcott, with soil samples already taken and a notebook full of penetrometer readings. He and Harlan walked the 55 acres for 2 hours, and Harlan answered questions the same way Earl Fitch had answered his directly and without softening the parts that were hard to hear. He told Brent what the first 3 years would look like, what the operating costs would run, what the neighbors would say, and what the ground would say back if he was patient enough to listen for it. Brent Alcott bought the Odo County ground that November. 48 acres at $190 an acre, cash, no loan. He would farm it for the next 20 years, using a version of the method Harlan had developed on the Reinhardt ground, and by 2005 it would be assessed at $1,200 an acre. Roger Stiles drove him to the farm the day he signed the papers. He did not introduce himself as a dealer. He told Brent he was someone who had made a significant mistake and wanted to make sure at least one person benefited from the education it had cost him. Harlan heard about that from Brent, not from Roger. He thought about it for a while. Then he thought about what his father would have said and what Earl would have said, and he decided that a man who uses his own error to help someone else is doing approximately the right thing, and that was enough. Let me tell you about the years between 1993 and 2001, because this is where the accounting becomes something larger than one man's 55 acres. Harlan's total net income from the 55 acres between 1983 and 2001 came to $191,000. His total documented investment over the same period, including the original purchase, all inputs, all equipment, fabrication and repair, and all fuel, was $18,400. He had not borrowed a dollar of it. He had not lost a night's sleep to a payment deadline. He had not watched a banker's truck pull up his driveway with papers that meant the end of something his family had built. The Farmall M was still running in 1998, 15 years after pulling the homemade subsoiler through hardpan clay at 1.5 miles an hour. The machine that Glenn Dewey had run to 11,000 hours was still working ground with his son at the controls. Harlan replaced the head gasket in 1994 and rebuilt the carburetor in 1997, and considered both of those events routine maintenance, the kind of work a man does on a machine he intends to keep. The M was not fast. It had never been fast. It had also never failed him in a field when he needed it to work. Dr. Carolyn Voss published her final paper on the Dewey operation in 1999, a longitudinal study covering 16 years of soil health data on what her abstract described as a severely compacted clay soil in eastern Nebraska that had undergone complete biological remediation without synthetic inputs. The paper was cited 11 times in subsequent literature on regenerative agriculture and soil health in the Great Plains. It did not use Harlan's name. It used his county, his soil classification, and his yield data, and anyone in Cass County who read it knew exactly whose ground it was describing. Danny Pruitt read it. He drove out to the farm on a Tuesday with a copy, set it on the kitchen table, and pointed to the yield figures in Table 3. "That's your ground," he said. Harlan looked at the table. He did not read the abstract or the methodology or the discussion section. He looked at Table 3 for a moment and then set the paper down. "It's the ground's ground," he said. "I just helped it remember what it was." Danny picked the paper back up and put it in his truck and drove back to Plattsmouth, and he kept that copy in his desk drawer for the next 11 years. Now let me tell you about Norma, because she deserves to be in this accounting, and she would not have put herself there. In the fall of 1999, Norma was diagnosed with a cardiac condition that required medication and rest and a reduction in the physical work she had done without complaint for 37 years of marriage. She took the news the way she took most news, which was to ask the doctor two practical questions and then decide what needed to change, and change it without dwelling on what could not be changed. She stopped coming to the field during the busy weeks. She stayed closer to the house. But on a Thursday afternoon in late October during the last week of harvest, Harlan came in from the field at noon to find her gone. He found her in the barn lot standing beside the M, which he had parked there the previous evening, with the engine still ticking as it cooled. She had her hand on the front axle housing. He walked out and stood beside her. "It looks the same as it always did," she said. "It mostly is," he said. She looked out toward the 55 acres, which were showing the dark stubble of harvested corn in the October light clean rows across ground that had been declared dead in 1983. "The ground looks different than it used to," she said. "It is different," he said. "We made it different." She stood with her hand on the M for another minute, not saying anything more. Then she went back inside and Harlan finished his harvest, and that evening she made supper, and they ate at the kitchen table where they had sat together the night before the auction in February of 1983, and the tractor was in the barn and the ground was resting, and the accounting between them was very close to complete. In the spring of 2001, a soil scientist named Dr. Janet Merritt from the University of Nebraska received a referral from Danny Pruitt regarding a parcel in Cass County that had appeared in a 1999 soil health study and showed long-term recovery data that she might find worth examining in person. She drove out in April with a graduate student and spent one day on the ground. Her measurements showed organic matter at 4.1%. The original 1983 baseline had been 0.8. The earthworm count was 19 per cubic foot. The county average on Class 1 native soil was 16. Water infiltration rate was 290% higher than the 1983 baseline. She called 3 colleagues from the farm road before she drove back to Lincoln. The parcel she was standing on had begun as the worst ground in Cass County. It was now producing yields above the county average on Class 1 soil at operating costs less than half the county standard, with no synthetic inputs and no debt, and its biological health metrics exceeded the best native agricultural ground in the region. Harlan was 69 years old. He was still farming. The M was still running. Let me tell you about the last thing because it happened the way the important things in this story always happen, without announcement and without anyone planning it. In 2001, Harlan's son Dale was farming in Butler County. He was 31 years old and had grown up watching his father work the Reinhardt ground. He knew the method, the way children know things they have absorbed without being formally taught, which is to say he knew it in his hands before he knew it in his words. An 80-acre parcel came available in Butler County that spring, advertised at $165 an acre. The ground had been described by the county extension office as severely degraded high clay content compaction issues at 12 inches. Everyone who looked at it walked away. Dale called his father. Harlan listened. He asked 2 questions. What did the penetrometer show? And had Dale taken samples below the pan layer to see what was waiting under it? Dale had. He read the numbers over the phone. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Take the soil probe first," he said. "If the hard pan is there, buy it. If it isn't, walk away. You already took the probe. You know what's there." Dale said he was worried about the 3 years before it paid. "Your grandfather farmed 160 acres with no debt and no new equipment for 40 years, Harlan said. "He left me something worth farming. That is the only inheritance that lasts. Buy the ground and farm it the way we farmed the Reinhardt place. The method does not change because the county does." Dale Dewey bought the 80 acres in Butler County for $165 an acre. He used the same rotation, the same biological approach, the same patient accounting his father had used on the 55 acres 18 years earlier. By 2008, the ground was yielding above the Butler County average on Class 1 soil, and its assessed value had increased by 612% from the purchase price. He named the best corner of that field after his grandfather. He never told anyone that part. Harlan found out from Norma, who found out from Dale's wife, which is how the important information always moved in that family. Harlan heard it one evening at the kitchen table and did not say anything about it for a long time. Then he said it was the right thing to do and went back to what he had been reading. The county assessor who had written the original classification on the Reinhardt ground, the notation from 1972, that called it severely degraded and non-agricultural quality retired in 1999. On his last day, he pulled Harlan's parcel file and looked through it. He looked at the 1983 purchase price and the 1987 assessed value and the yield records and Dr. Voss's paper that Danny Pruitt had attached to the file years earlier. He sat with it for a while. Then he crossed out the original classification notation and wrote 2 words in the margin: Dewey's ground. The tackboard in Harlan's barn, the one his father had built from cedar planks in 1948 and hung beside the M's parking spot, had a piece of wood mounted on it that Norma had found in the workshop in 1988. She had sanded it smooth and written on it in the careful hands she used for things that were meant to stay. She had put it on the tackboard without asking, and Harlan had seen it there and left it where she put it. He had never moved it. He never intended to. It said, "The ground nobody wants is the ground nobody's ruined yet." Danny Pruitt drove past the Dewey farm every working day for 19 years on his route between the assessor's office and the south end of the county. He passed the tackboard sign on the barn when the big door was open, which it usually was in the working months. He read it every time. He quoted it at a soil health symposium in Lincoln in 2009, and the room was quiet after he said it, the way rooms go quiet when a sentence arrives at exactly the right time. Today, farmland in Nebraska averages between $4,000 and $6,000 per acre in the counties where Harlan Dewey farmed. Young farmers face the same arithmetic that destroyed 14,000 Nebraska operations in the 1980s. The same pressure to borrow against inflated values, the same dealers with clean suits and new pickups and good arguments about why this time the expansion will hold. The inputs cost more. The equipment costs more. The debt loads are larger. The logic is identical. A new Case IH subsoiler runs close to $12,000. Harlan's ran 340, and it lasted 18 years, and the ground it opened is still producing above county averages without a bag of synthetic fertilizer having been applied to it in 4 decades. The lesson is not complicated. Broken ground is not the same as worthless ground. A low price is not the same as a bad investment. Patience is not the same as passivity. An old machine you understand is worth more than a new machine that owns you. And the man who works quietly beside the road while everyone else drives past and shakes their heads is not always the man who is wrong. Harlan Dewey farmed the Reinhardt ground for 27 years, from February of 1983 until he retired in 2010 at 78 years old. He never took out an operating loan. He never bought a new tractor. He never lost a night's sleep to a payment deadline, which is a form of freedom that does not appear in any county land record, but is real nonetheless, as real as anything measured in bushels or dollars or pounds per square inch. The M finally needed an engine rebuild in 2006 that Harlan decided was a reasonable expense for a machine he intended to keep. He did the work himself in the shop over a winter, with parts ordered through a catalog, and drove the M back to the field in April with 62 years on its frame and the rebuilt engine turning over with the same low honest pulse it had always had. It was not fast. It had never been fast. The ground on the 55 acres as of the last soil survey, conducted during Harlan's farming years, had organic matter levels above 4%, earthworm counts above 18 per cubic foot, and a water infiltration rate that exceeded every adjacent parcel regardless of soil classification. It had started at 0.8% organic matter and 320 pounds per square inch of hardpan. It had been called worthless and written off and passed over at auction until a man who believed his father raised his hand. The ground nobody wants is the ground nobody's ruined yet. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me about something someone told you was finished that turned out not to be. It does not have to be about soil. Drop a 1 if you know what patience costs and what it pays. Subscribe if you want more stories about the quiet men who turned out to be right, and share this with someone who is being told right now that what they believe in is not worth believing in.